Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Can Love Last? The Fate of Romance Over Time by Stephen A. Mitchell. Narrated by Lofbomm. Forward. Margaret Black, CSW. Our world is filled with brilliant thinkers. We are regularly flooded with amazing information. Details on our apparent potential to artificially replicate human intelligence, the intricacies of genetics, the increasing likelihood of producing a viable human clone. The issues that touch most directly on our everyday experience, however, remain somehow opaque, mysterious, conceptually documented, yet experientially unresolved and unsatisfying. We have been granted one life to live. We want it to be fulfilling, meaningful. We want it to sustain love and passion. Many of us long for passion that will emerge and endure in a relationship with a particular important other. The questions seem easy enough to frame. What allows us to feel that our intimate relationships are passionate as well as meaningful? Can this kind of meaningful passion last over time? How can it survive given the challenges we subject it to? Living busy lives, dealing with everyday familiarity, raising children, growing older. Our best thinkers seem to have little to offer us here. Despite his genius and astonishing productivity as the creator of psychoanalysis, Freud's formulations have not been particularly helpful, certainly not very optimistic. Within his conception of human psychology, sexual passion and enduring love have separate derivations, one primitive, one civilized, locking them in an inversely proportional relationship. A passionate sexual relationship with one's partner bodes poorly for tenderness and respect, and vice versa. Psychoanalysis, which prides itself on reaching the deepest understanding of emotional life, seemed to have taken us to a conceptual dead end. Decades have passed since Freud lived and wrote. Yet there has been astonishingly little new thinking in an area that affects us all so fundamentally. Having lived with Stephen for nearly 30 years, having worked with him and raised a family, one of the qualities I always loved about him was his ecumenical approach to ideas. His kind of mind flourished in the contemporary postmodern intellectual climate, joyfully constructing and deconstructing, combining and recombining ideas gleaned from his extensive reading and clinical work. Blessed with rigorous intellectual honesty, good thinking fascinated him, no matter what the discipline. He loved ideas, loved to play with them, to stretch them, to see how they held up on relentless probing, and, above all, to share them with others. He appreciated the thinking of others in a way that made their ideas seem like generous gifts for which he was deeply grateful. Accompanying him to a bookstore was like watching a kid in a candy store. We would inevitably leave, bags heavy with philosophy texts, poetry, a recently published novel, some obscure publication on physics that caught his attention, books on the mind, artificial intelligence, Buddhism, and sometimes on psychoanalysis. There was a kind of implicit contest in our lives together. Would the prints I had purchased be successfully framed and hung on the wall before he claimed the wall space for another set of bookshelves? He listened to taped courses on the history of music while he exercised. He loved the fine presentation of ideas, and read passages aloud to the family when he ran across something with a particularly fine turn of phrase or thought-provoking presentation. Inheriting from his family of origin a healthy disdain for authoritarian structure, it quickly became clear that Stephen's thinking could not be constrained by rigidly held principles within psychoanalysis, no matter how distressing or disruptive his challenges were to the profession. Early in his own career, shortly after he had completed his training, he was among the first authors within the psychoanalytic tradition to openly and effectively challenge the then firmly held belief that homosexuality was fundamentally pathological. 1978-1981, an effort that eventually resulted in its removal from the official psychiatric nomenclature of pathology. Stephen rather romped through the extensive literature in psychoanalysis, which was at the time sharply segregated into competing theoretical traditions and heavily dominated by the classical Freudian approach, an approach that declared alternative positions to be non-analytic and therefore marginal. In an effort to encourage more creative thinking in the field, he launched his own journal called psychoanalytic dialogues, employing what was at the time a revolutionary format of publishing the non-classical marginalized voices within psychoanalysis, as well as organizing respectful discussions among analysts of differing theoretical persuasions, so that clinical approaches and theoretical formulations could be more thoughtfully and comparatively considered. He organized conferences, inviting representatives of diverse academic disciplines to consider a common problem in human experience. Immersing himself in the divisions and controversies within psychoanalysis, Stephen became interested in what he felt were relatively unrecognized but potentially generative common threads running through positions ostensibly at odds with one another. With other like-minded colleagues, he began to redefine the psychoanalytic project, focusing not on the interpretation of sexual and aggressive strivings and symptom removal, but on issues like the quality of life, the meaningfulness of personal experience, one's sense of self and a connectedness with others. In a culture where the analyst's knowledge and authority had defined the analytic process, Stephen's clinical approach, identified as relational psychoanalysis, emphasized collaboration, open engagement between patient and analyst, empowering the patient's participation through thought-provoking questions rather than claiming privileged knowledge with declarative interpretations that presumed to reveal what was really going on in the patient's mind. There were many issues that interested Stephen in his clinical work, but the question of how passionate connections stayed alive was always there, the frequent focus in his published clinical vignettes, and a common topic of our discussions together. While we both took great care to protect the identity and confidentiality of our patients, we enjoyed helping each other with clinical dilemmas and sharing new insights, mulling over the perplexing yet fascinating issues our clinical work raised for us. What was the underlying drama when a woman felt the chemistry was never right with the men she dated? Or when someone didn't know if he was really in love with another person? How could these personal stalemates be opened up, energized in the process of therapy, allowing the person to arrive at a truly meaningful answer? Was it an expression of our freer sexual mores, our greater interest in diversity, that married or committed partners so often had affairs? Or was this explanation an easy and comfortable cover for difficulties in becoming more intimate with a partner? Is there only one right one? Can one who isn't right become so? How much work should one put into a relationship? What constitutes productive work in a relationship, as opposed to a tedious kind of overanalyzing that avoids acknowledging the relationship is essentially not viable? Given that Stephen and I had been together for so many years and cared very much about the quality of our relationship, we felt allied with our patients in wanting help with these kinds of issues. Stephen did not take on projects randomly. He was attracted to important areas where existing thinking seemed to him faulty or overly constricting. He had taken on issues like the structure of the psychoanalytic profession, the marginalization of homosexuals, the disenfranchised voices within psychoanalysis, the reconceptualization of psychoanalysis as a treatment. He wrote many books and an abundance of papers. Now for something really hard. He decided to think more systematically and write about love and passion in committed relationships. He wanted, in this project, to draw on the more contemporary and creative thinking within psychoanalysis, giving people greater access to contributions frequently missed in a culture that so readily and blindly equates psychoanalysis with antiquated Freudian formulations. Stephen also wanted to utilize contributions from outside psychoanalysis, contributions from philosophy, history, literature, in order to more deeply and productively engage the issues. He hoped to encourage a better connection between psychoanalysis and the larger world of ideas. Having come to the conclusion that psychoanalysis had for too long unnecessarily and unhelpfully privileged its contributions to thinking through problems, he decided that this book should not be directed toward the professional community of psychoanalysis, but should be just for people, the more general educated public. What can the listener expect of this book? Over the years, Stephen taught hundreds of students in his private study groups. His teaching within psychoanalysis was legendary. People joined his study groups and stayed in them for years, as the content was never redundant. There was never a party line that defined his teaching. He sometimes spoke to me about a particularly frustrating class, where students could only be critical of a reading that presented a point of view different from their own. He would describe his efforts to spark their curiosity, to interest them in considering the knotty problem the author was trying to unravel, to look at the issue from a new perspective, or to understand what a revolutionary contribution the particular author was making, if considered within the context of his or her orientation. One of his students remembered the experience this way. Listening to Stephen in our study group, I've often imagined him as a weaver, adding color and texture to a complete fabric, utilizing every fiber, every thread of thought. While Stephen certainly wanted to be respected as a thinker in his own right, he was not that interested in getting his students to agree with his particular thinking. He was interested in getting them to think. As a listener of this book, you are invited into a similar space. Parts of Can Love Last are highly entertaining, the writing sometimes poetic, the stories of dilemmas and struggles personally recognizable. It is a decidedly thought-provoking book. It does not deliver its message on a silver platter to a passive reader awaiting enlightenment. As in his clinical work, Stephen assumes in his writing that the most powerful impact comes from the listener's deeply personal engagement in the process. He implicitly asks you to think things through with him, to puzzle over the paradoxical nature of the human experience of passionate connection, to pause and search your own thoughts and experience as you consider the clinical descriptions provided to explicate challenges to sustaining romance in committed relationships. Stephen invites you into a collaboration, and in so doing, acknowledges and supports your intelligent capacity to more capably take your life into your own hands. Most important, I think you may find this book deeply moving in a personal sense. If you stay with it, you may find yourself pulled into nooks and crannies of your own experience and your own personal relationships, unfamiliar areas that you may never have really thought about before. You may find yourself not merely interested, but at times even perplexed, as though something within you had been opened like a door to a room you hadn't even known existed. Can love last? Stephen is not asking a rhetorical question. Rather, he is extending an invitation to all of us, an invitation to join him in rethinking some of the most profound and fundamental aspects of human experience and love relationships, allowing each one of us to come away with our own personal answer. Margaret Black, CSW, June 2001. The greatest weakness in contemporary thought seems to me to reside in the extravagant reverence for what we know, compared with what we do not yet know. André Breton. Oh, as I was young and easy in the mercy of his means. Time held me green and dying, though I sang in my chains like the sea. Dylan Thomas. Introduction. Sigmund Freud once attempted to account for the widespread resistance to his prodigious contributions to Western culture by positioning his discovery of the unconscious as the third of three powerful blows to human narcissism. The first, the cosmological blow, was the Copernican revolution. If the Earth orbits around the Sun, rather than the Sun around the Earth, we are faced with the hard truth that human beings are not located at the physical center of the universe, not at its core, not at its navel. Rather, we ourselves revolve in orbit around another center. The second, the biological blow, was the Darwinian revolution. If we humans have evolved from other animal species, we are faced with the hard truth that human beings were not uniquely created. We were not instantaneously designed of a piece by divine inspiration, but rather emerged slowly, over vast periods of time, in fits and starts, as life responded to changing circumstances. His discovery of the unconscious, Freud reasoned, was the third and most devastating assault, a psychological blow to our estimation of our own importance. Prior to Freud's revelations, we humans, in our diminished state, one among an infinite variety of life forms, out at the periphery rather than at the center of things, we diminutive humans could at least claim self-governance. But, Freud demonstrated, the human being is not even master in his own house. We do not even run our own minds. Mind is, according to Freud, a hierarchy of superordinated and subordinated agencies, a labyrinth of impulses striving independently of one another toward action. Our conscious experience is merely the tip of an immense iceberg of unconscious mental processes that really shape, unbeknownst to us, silently, impenetrably, and inexorably, our motives, our values, our actions. This, Freud believed, was hard for us to accept. I always thought Freud had this wrong. He was right about the immediate injury to the human sense of self-importance inflicted by each of these intellectual revolutions. But from his vantage point in history, Freud could not have imagined that the loss produced by each of these intellectual revolutions would be far outweighed by subsequent gains. The fuller implications of our Copernican decentering emerged only centuries later. Not only are we not at the center of things, but our impressive sun is just one among billions of other suns, many of them much more impressive. Perhaps even more astounding, it was only with the acceptance of the work of Edwin Powell Hubble, years after Freud's death, that we humans began to realize that many of what we had taken to be other suns, perhaps other planetary solar systems, are actually other galaxies, and that these myriad galaxies, of which ours is only one, are catapulting away from one another at astounding speeds. In light of these developments, I have always felt our ancestors' sense of diminishment at Copernicus's discoveries, although very understandable at the time, to be almost quaint. What do we take ourselves to be anyway? The center of everything? From our vantage point today, the loss of the overarching self-importance of our ancestors seems less consequential than the gains we have made in our understanding of the awesome, mind-rattling universe of which we are a part. Renouncing our claims to centrality has made it possible to regard ourselves as participants in something so extraordinary, so vast, that it would have been unimaginable to Copernicus, and even to Freud. Similarly, even though it is nearly a century and a half since Darwin's remarkable genius enabled him to grasp the process of evolution and its basic mechanisms, we are still working out many of the implications of that jolting dislocation of humans from a wholly unique, hallowed position vis-à-vis other forms of life. At first, the immediate challenge seemed to be to theism itself. If we are not the product of an instantaneous creation, it was reasoned by believers and non-believers alike, then perhaps there is no creator at all. The loss of humankind's special status among other animals seemed inevitably linked with the loss of a plausible belief in the existence of the divine itself. It was as if, to paraphrase Nietzsche, God and our elevated sense of importance died together. But in recent years, more thoughtful religious thinkers, in contrast to the creationists, have demonstrated that a belief in a divine design or divine will does not have to fall with evolutionary theory. Rather, theologians have come to appreciate the workings of the divine in more complex, less simplistic terms than did our ancestors. And for many non-religious thinkers, a deeper relationship to nature and to life itself has emerged, across the varieties of environmentalism as a contemporary secular religion. Regarding ourselves as one species among others in the infinite array of earthly life forms is generally no longer experienced as a diminution, rather an appreciation of our small place, and perhaps big responsibility within the ecosphere, has made it possible for many people to experience themselves as an inextricable part of something vast and beautiful, the panoply of life itself, decentered as we are within the universe, dislocated within nature. Freud's destabilization of our vision of the human mind as transparent to itself and ruled by conscious reason seemed yet another loss, difficult to bear. But like the Copernican and Darwinian revolutions, the Freudian revolution has also brought, over time, potential gifts for our always tenuous efforts to bolster our self-esteem. Here, too, what we were defending turned out to be worth less than what now became available to us. Our conscious control over our minds is limited, we now realize. But we are not merely our conscious minds. We are also our unconscious processes, though not in quite the same way. What we are called upon to give up is a certain kind of hubris. What we gain is participation in something much richer and more complex than we ever took ourselves to be. We can no longer maintain our prerogatives as rulers over the small fiefdom of conscious rationality. Gone forever is the view of ourselves as singular, transparent, self-generating, and self-controlling agents. We are multiplicitous, we have discovered. with areas of experience that are more or less opaque, as well as areas of experience that are more or less transparent. Each of us has become a kind of variegated psychic community. Being a person seems now to be much more complicated and involving than ever before. It requires discovering ourselves, as well as shaping ourselves, exploring ourselves, as well as controlling ourselves. Practicing psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, as I have done for almost 30 years, provides an interesting, in some respects unique, vantage point for observing and participating in people's struggle to understand just what and who they are. It is very difficult, I rediscover many times each day, for us to come to terms with the stark limitations on the kinds of control it is possible to maintain over our lives and ourselves. Yet we continue to insist, both consciously and unconsciously, that we have more control than we do over our feelings, our relationships, our fates. Freud's phrase for such fantasies, introduced nearly 90 years ago, was omnipotence of thought. And we are just as committed to omnipotence today as were Freud's contemporaries. A conviction of being in control is central to our sense of safety. Yet the imposition of illusory control chokes the richness out of life. Omnipotence degrades authentic experience into shallow manipulation. The more endangered we feel, the more control we seek. The more illusory are the controls we strive to maintain, the more vitality seeps out of our lives. This book is about romance and its degradation. It is about romance because I want to explore the struggle for vitality and meaning in the lives of those of us living at the cusp of the 20th and 21st centuries. Vitality and meaning are not easy to come by, as evidenced by the endless succession of books, magazines, and television shows on self-help techniques, popular psychology, and popular spirituality. Modern life, at all points on the socioeconomic scale, is difficult, draining, and confusing. What is it that imparts to life a sense of robustness? A quality of purpose and excitement? A feeling that one's life is worth not only living, but also cultivating and savoring? Romance, I am suggesting, has a great deal to do with it. There are many different forms of romance, including both romance in our relationship to ourselves and romance in relation to the world around us, what we take to be the natural as opposed to the humanly constructed world. Self-directed romance has recently been termed narcissism, and many psychologists now consider it to be crucial to our sense of identity. And nature, the wilderness, is enormously alluring to many people in our time as something they want to get back to. We will be touching on both of these forms of romance, but we will be primarily exploring romance as a form of loving others. Aristotle claimed at the dawn of Western culture that we are social animals. But it is only in recent decades that we have come to appreciate just how thoroughly social we are. We are born with brains requiring extensive social interaction and language to complete their wiring. We become, inevitably and irreversibly, extraordinarily like the caregivers we require to nurture us through a lengthy dependency. And we spend our adult lives, to a considerable extent, with other people. Actually present people with whom we live and interact. The ubiquitous virtual people of television, film, and print media. The past people who reside within us as memories and internal presences, inhabiting our subjective world even in solitude. And the generic people who have provided us with language and symbolic systems in which to think and organize experience. And because our lives are so much with people, the quality of our relationships with others is central to the emotional quality of our lives, the very lifefulness of our lives, the texture, the tonal quality, the verve. The romance is a literary form appealing to emotion, the imagination, and ideals. And the Romantic movement was a revolution in consciousness as well as in the arts. A turn toward passion, the tragic, and personal meaning that has amounted to, according to Isaiah Berlin, the deepest and most lasting of all changes in the life of the West. We will be exploring the ways in which this pervasive historical shift in human experience comes alive in the individual lives of people in our time. The term romance, in its common everyday usage, pertains to a particular feeling state and a mode of relating to another person, which generates emotions, stimulates imaginative play, and nurtures devotion to ideals. Romance emerges in relation to love, a particular sort of love in which there are powerful erotic currents. Romance is closer to falling in love than to being in love. Romance is also closely related to meaning, but not to the ponderous kind or the important sort of meaning that can be generated by suffering and travail. The kind of meaning associated with romance is the feeling that life is worthwhile, that important events can and do happen within it. Yet, because of the inherent instability of romance, the tragic is often its counterpoint, making the blues, with their expression of pathos and guilt, the quintessential romantic narrative. People in our time seek romance to give their lives meaning. It often works, for a while. Romance can be captivating. It takes things over, adds verve, depth, and excitement about being alive. Yet what people in our time say about romance, across the spectrum from high culture to mass-market magazines and tabloids, is that romance fades. It tends to be short-lived. Authentic romance is hard to find and even harder to maintain. It easily degrades into something else, much less captivating, much less enlivening, such as sober respect or purely sexual diversion, predictable companionship, or hatred, guilt, and self-pity. But what is it about romance that makes it so degradable? Most people and most psychological experts have opinions. Here are some of the most popular. Romance fades because time and success are its enemies. Romance thrives on novelty, mystery, and danger. It is dispersed by familiarity. Enduring romance is therefore a contradiction in terms. Romance fades because it is driven by sexuality. And sexuality is primitive in its very nature. In its raw form, lust is not a pretty thing and is difficult to reconcile with other features of romantic love, such as respect and admiration. So, romance tends to degrade into either dispassionate friendship or purely sexual encounters. Romance fades because it is inspired by idealization, and idealization is, by definition, illusory. We fall in love under the spell of fantasy. Time is the enemy of romance because it brings reality and inevitable disillusionment. So, romance tends to degrade into either sober, passionless respect or bitter disappointment. Romance fades because it turns easily into hatred. There is a dark side to human psychology, and the delicacy of romance cannot long sustain itself against the power of innate aggression. Romance is like fireworks in the dark night, thrilling but inevitably transitory. We are lucky if we can simply get along. Romance fades because nothing stays the same, especially people. We long for constancy in our relations with one another, but we inevitably betray one another miserably. Life itself is fundamentally tragic, and ultimately, we all end up singing the blues, either about our own regrets, guilt, or about the failings of others, self-pity. There is a ring of truth to each of these explanations, which is why they have such broad currency. However, their truths are only partial. We will be exploring each one, mining what is useful and reconfiguring partial insights into a fuller account. We will find again and again that it is not that romance itself has a tendency to become degraded, but that we expend considerable effort degrading it. And we are interested in degrading it for very good reasons. I will be drawing on many sources, the most important of which are the lives of the people I have been privileged to know in my clinical work. Because of the need for confidentiality, these people are carefully disguised. There is nothing here that is simply made up, but often the cases are composites of work with several different patients with similar issues. Despite popular misconceptions, contemporary psychoanalysis is very different from the classical psychoanalysis of the past. Traditional analysts tended to reverently apply Freud's pansexual imagination to all areas of human life in a way that was often reductionistic, elitist, and authoritarian. But the heart of psychoanalysis, its most enduring contribution to Western culture, has been its commitment to the compassionate, collaborative study of the fine-grained texture of individual human lives, in all their complexity and intensity. Contemporary clinicians, particularly those identifying with the label relational psychoanalysis, have shed, along with the Victorian chaise lounge, many other trappings of traditional psychoanalysis. What remains
Sample complete. Ready to continue?